And just walking around inside, it will generate some optic flow, but nothing like the sort of optic flow that you can generate in larger environments, like out-of-doors environments. If you can't get outdoors, doing it indoors is perfectly fine, but it's not going to have the same magnitude of positive effect. Now, in order to get the alertness, I do it outdoors because I also want sunlight in my eyes. I know many of you have heard me talk about this ad nauseum on various podcasts and this podcast, but getting sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning is absolutely vital to mental and physical health. It is perhaps the most important thing that any and all of us can and should do in order to promote metabolic well-being, promote the positive functioning of your hormone system, get your mental health steering in the right direction. There are a number of reasons for this, but before I get into those reasons, let me just emphasize what the protocol is. The protocol is get outdoors, ideally with no sunglasses if you can do that safely, even if there's cloud cover. More photons, light information, are coming through that cloud cover than would be coming from a very bright indoor bulb. So getting outdoors is absolutely key. How long should you do this? It's going to depend on the brightness of the environment. It's going to depend on a number of different factors. 2 minutes would be a minimum. 10 minutes would be even better. And if you can, 30 minutes would be fantastic. Now, if it's a very bright day or, you live in a place where there's bright sunlight, clear day on a snowfield, you would only need something like 60 seconds. But most people aren't living in those sorts of conditions. So getting outside for a 10-minute walk or a 15-minute walk will basically ensure that you're getting adequate stimulation of these neurons in the eye that are called the melanopsin intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells. I know that's a mouthful. These are neurons that don't care about shapes of objects or the motion of objects. These are neurons that convey to the brain that it's daytime and it's time to be alert. And it sets in motion a huge number of biological cascades within every cell and organ of your body, from your liver to your gut to your heart to your brain. It really sets things down the right path. Early in the day, we experience a natural and healthy bump in a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol comes from the amygdala. That cortisol, as I mentioned, is healthy and normal and promotes wakefulness. It actually promotes a healthy immune system. So I know you've heard that stress and cortisol disrupt the immune system, but not the short little pulse of cortisol that you get each morning. It's very important that that pulse of cortisol arrive early in the day. I want to emphasize this again. It's very important that that pulse of cortisol arrive early in the day. And that pulse of cortisol is going to happen once every 24 hours, no matter what. It's going to happen, and you get to time it. How do you time it? Primarily by when you view bright sunlight or bright light of another kind. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So you want that cortisol pushed early. If you wake up before the sun comes out, it's fine to turn on artificial lights, but then you would want to get outside as soon as you can to get this natural light stimulation of your eyes. And it does have to be to your eyes. Just to really drill down into the details for a moment, you don't want to stare directly at the sun or any light that's so bright that it feels painful. If you feel like you have to close your eyes or blink, please do. You don't want to damage your retinas. The point here is to get the sunlight indirectly. It's going to essentially be scattered everywhere through the cloud cover, but from looking at a flashlight directly into that flashlight versus looking at the beam that flashlight generates on the ground, that if you're standing in the shade, you're going to get less of that sunlight than you are if you're out in an open field. So this is why the time outside it's going to need to vary depending on your particular environment. But do your best to do this every day. If you miss a day, no big deal, but try not to miss more than one day. Otherwise, your mental and physical health will start to suffer. And doing this each day costs nothing. It's just time. You can combine it with the forward ambulation, with the walk and the optic flow that I talked about before. And that's what I do each morning to generate a sense of alertness in my body and brain, to generate a sense of calm yet alert. And that's also what I do with Costello, with my bulldog. People have asked me, do these same mechanisms apply to animals? Well, the reality is many of these mechanisms were actually discovered in animals and then were tested in humans and verified that they also exist in humans. Not always. Sometimes it was the reverse, where they were tested first in humans and then brought to animals. But indeed, your dog, your horse, I don't know what other animals are out there. They need this. Now, if you have a hamster or a nocturnal animal, The reason why they like to run on their wheels at night is because they're nocturnal. They don't like being in the light. Light actually causes them to freeze, right? Actually, if you are into aquaria, you like fish, they always say, don't overfeed your fish. You'll kill the fish. That's true. But guess what? The fastest way to kill a fish is to keep the lights on 24 hours a day. They also need circadian rhythms, these 24-hour rhythms. So we'll do an entire month at some point about pet health, but meanwhile, get that morning sunlight. So now we have a first protocol, which is to write down the time of day that you wake up. The second protocol is to take a walk first thing in the morning. And the third protocol is woven in with that walk, at least for me, which is to get that sunlight exposure. I'm a big believer, based on quality peer-reviewed data, that hydration is essential for mental performance. Now, I confess I don't really like drinking big glasses or big jugs of water first thing in the morning. I don't know why, but my thirst doesn't tend to kick in first thing. You may be different. Either way, I force myself essentially to drink at least 16 and most days 32 ounces of water. I also put a little bit of sea salt in the water. As many of you know, neurons require ionic flow. What that means is neurons need sodium, they need magnesium, and they need potassium in order to function. We do tend to get dehydrated at night. Even if the day is not very hot, I try and top off, or I try and make sure that I'm hydrated early in the day before I begin any work. So I make myself drink this water with a little bit of sea salt. How much sea salt, if you really want to get detailed, I suppose it's about half a teaspoon. It's not much. That's what I do. And I drink that more or less room temperature. I find that drinking really cold water first thing in the day kind of like cramps up my insides. So I don't do that. At that point, I start thinking about and fantasizing about and craving caffeine, but I don't drink that caffeine yet. I purposely delay my caffeine intake to 90 minutes to 120 minutes after I wake up. Of course, I know when I wake up because I wrote it down, although it's pretty easy to commit to memory. The reason I delay caffeine is because one of the factors that induces a sense of sleepiness is the buildup of adenosine, or as some people call it, adenosine, in our system. The buildup of adenosine accumulates the longer we are awake. So when I wake up in the morning, when you wake up in the morning, your adenosine levels are likely to be very low. However, caffeine is an adenosine blocker. It's actually a competitive antagonist for you aficionados. It sort of parks in the receptor that adenosine normally would park at and prevents adenosine from acting on that receptor. That's why you feel more alert, because it's essentially blocking the effect of this sleepiness factor that we all create called adenosine. The reason for delaying caffeine intake 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking is I want to make sure that I don't have a late afternoon or even early afternoon crash from caffeine. One of the best ways to ensure a caffeine crash is to drink a bunch of caffeine, block all those adenosine receptors, and then by early or late afternoon, when that caffeine starts to wear off and gets dislodged from the receptors, a lower level of adenosine is able to create a greater level of sleepiness. It took me years to figure this out. I used to wake up and I'd think, I don't want to drink caffeine too close to bedtime, so I'm going to start drinking my caffeine really early. I let my cortisol naturally come up in the morning. I avoid drinking caffeine until about 90 minutes or 2 hours after waking. And when I do that, I find that I don't experience the afternoon crash. At least I don't experience that crash unless I do something foolish like ingest far too much food at lunch, or I stay up all night the night before. But provided I don't do anything foolish like that, delaying caffeine to 90 minutes to 2 hours optimizes this relationship between adenosine and wakefulness and sleepiness in a way that really provides a nice, consistent arc of energy throughout the day and brings energy down as I'm headed toward sleep and falling asleep. My primary objective early in the day is to get into a mode of being focused yet alert so that I can get work done. I found that the best way for me to achieve that state is through fasting. So I don't eat anything until about 11 a.m. or 12 noon. I'm not absolutely religious about it. There are days when I'll have a few Brazil nuts or a spoonful or 3 of almond butter, for instance. But most days I'm not doing that. I'm just not eating anything. I'm drinking some caffeine. Caffeine source for me is yerba mate, guayusa tea. Those are my preferred sources. I tend to avoid coffee these days. Occasionally I'll have a cup, but most often I stick to the teas. I drink water as much as I feel I need to and want to. And I also drink my athletic greens, which is compatible, at least for me, with fasting. Let's talk about why fasting works to create this heightened state of alertness, yet calm brain state. Fasting increases levels of adrenaline, also called epinephrine, in the brain and body. And when our levels of epinephrine and adrenaline are increased, we learn better, we can focus better. There's terrific data supporting that. You don't want epinephrine, aka adrenaline, too high. That feels like stress and panic. You get jittery, you can't focus. But in its optimal range, adrenaline really provides a heightened sense of focus and the ability to encode, meaning bring in, and retain, remember information. And so since my job is mainly a cerebral one where I'm writing grants and working on papers, etc., I fast in the early part of the day. I mentioned ingesting things like guayusa or yerba mate, or in my case, athletic greens. Many people ask, in fact, there's a whole community and discussion boards, etc., and YouTube comments on the internet about what breaks a fast and what doesn't. The fact of the matter is that's going to be highly individual because it's going to depend on how sensitive your blood sugar is. And more accurately, it's going to depend on things like your insulin sensitivity.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe.